Now this, for me, tends to be a bit of a difficult shot because what I'm going to do is try and draw in a little bit more detail the tendons coming from the thumb and the way that there's a between the thumb and the fingers there's a bit of a pad of muscle there that when it's drawn well it really can look pretty powerful. Um, so I'm going to try and get that across here, drawing some shadowing away from the knuckles. And you can see my shadowing is almost like line weight. It's just a little bit more pronounced. So here's my wrinkling again, trying to use a hook line as much as possible rather than just a simple curve or a straight line. A hook line is just great because straight, rigid lines have a lot of strength to them, and curved lines can look a little bit soft, and which to a certain effect, if that's the effect you're looking for a certain thing that you're drawing, is good. But if you want your drawing to look powerful, it can be a little bit counterproductive. So using a curve with a bit of a hook can keep a lot of power in a curved line. So I'm kind of working my way up, and I think you can see that I'm maybe even avoiding the thing that I'm really going to be drawing here, and that's those tendons. But here we go. There's that muscle that I'm talking about. And there's behind the muscle, towards the wrist, there's a bit of a flat area that kind of rests between tendons. And here I've got the tendons coming up around that bone. It looks a little better. The wrist is very, very complex thing to draw, and there are a lot of little bones that make up the wrist. And truth be told, I find with a lot of anatomy, what works is just to know how to draw convincing looking muscles, the way that they connect, and then just going in there and hoping for the best. And what I'm always looking for, I'm always looking for something that looks believable, but and also has some power to it. So I might actually over accentuate some bones a little bit, and some tendons and things, maybe a little bit more than they would be in real life. But I'm looking for something that's got some power. Now I'm just laying in my basic structuring the same way that I always do. I'm drawing in the segments for my fingers. I know essentially where my knuckles are going to be, so I'm not really drawing in the basic little circles to describe the knuckles. I'm more drawing the segments of the fingers. I find that the palm of the hand is, in a way, some ways it's easier than the back of the hand, but in some ways it can be much more challenging. And one of the more challenging areas for me is the connection between the thumb and the finger on the inside. There's a bit of a stretching of the skin there, and depending on whether you have the thumb fully extended from the finger or if it's folded into the finger, there's a lot of movement in the skin that happens there, and it can be very difficult to make that work from every angle. Again, you really need to fall back on your own hands while you're drawing to make that work. It's something that it's very difficult to offer a set of definitive rules for things like folding skin. I think so much of that just really needs to be observation. So here's a hand, palm up, with a bit of a powerful gesture, and you can see I've got the thumb raised up quite a bit, and not just flattened down. It gives the hand more of a claw-like appearance. And I'm actually, as I draw this, I'm using my own hand a little bit. I'm looking at it. I'm looking at the way that the skin folds underneath the inside of the thumb there, and that's why I've drawn that maybe a little more accurately than I would have had I not done that. So now that I've got the basic form in there, I'm just erasing it down with my kneaded eraser, and drawing in the fingers more cleanly. Another area that can be very difficult, and is difficult really to easily describe, is similar to the connection between the thumb and the fingers. The way that skin folds or stretches is the way that the webbing folds or stretches. Because if you just splay your fingers, you'll see that the webbing just stretches out nicely between the fingers, but depending on how you fold the fingers, the webbing actually folds on itself, and you have to be very aware of the way that it folds. It's something that you can only really do by looking at your own hand. It's not something that it's really very easy for me to describe in a video, so observation is very important for that. Putting my little wrinkles for the knuckles, I pretty much approach that the same way every single time. So much of what I do, I think the only way that you can possibly work in any kind of a sane way is to just have a shorthand for a lot of different things, and I definitely do. And I'm kind of going in here and trying to shore up my connecting points. You can see where forms are coming in front of other forms. I try as hard as I can to make sure that those points where the lines connect are drawn cleanly and clearly, and they actually connect. Because if they don't, very quickly a drawing can just start to kind of collapse on itself and not really hold together, and it ends up looking flat. I actually worked with an inker years ago that, for some reason, his style was based around breaking up every connection point. I've seen a few inkers do that, and it's just really a lack of knowledge of the way to make a picture hold together. Is actually really fighting against what works to make something have some depth. So I'm lighting this hand from above, and the knuckles obviously are bumps outward from the fingers, so they catch some light, and below them they cast a bit of shadow. As much as I like to use photo reference, I hate to be a slave to it. So generally speaking, for the most part, I don't use reference for hands or for anything really. And the lighting that I'm doing it's a little bit trial and error. It took me a long time to get comfortable with the lighting for not just hands, for a lot of things. And I found for me to light a hand like this, I needed to look at my own hand and put it under the light and get comfortable with that. And then once I get that, like with this hand, I really didn't do that at all. This is all just made up, but it's really based on the lighting that I learned from observation. There are some great artists that I'm heavily influenced by. Kevin Nolan draws amazing hands. I think if I could recommend one artist at all, it would be Mike Mignola for his hands. They're very, very simple, but when you're really learning how to draw just the simple forms that go into making up a hand, to me, I think he's the best. They're very, very simple forms that he's drawing, only putting in the lines that are absolutely necessary to get the idea across. And he has the greatest gestures. They're amazing. So you might want to take a look at his artwork. And for rendering the tendons and the final look of a hand, I think Kevin Nolan's great at breaking it down. His sense of anatomical structure is pretty unparalleled. So those are two really big influences for the way that I approach my hands. And I obviously I don't have the ability to detail a hand anywhere near as well as Kevin Nolan or draw a gesture anywhere near as well as Mike Mignola, but ultimately what you want to do with your influences is pick up enough of them and learn enough of them that you end up with something that works for you. Here's something: when you bunch your fist, the tendons on the inside of your arm can become pretty pronounced, and they can have a very powerful look if they're drawn well. So what I do to try if you just draw them as straight lines, it doesn't really have the kind of effect that I'm looking for. But I really like to use a lot of negative space when I'm drawing. Which negative space is just basically drawing things by drawing the shadows of those things rather than drawing the things themselves. So when I draw the veins and the tendons on his wrist, what I'm going to do is I've got their placement in right now. What I'm going to do is draw those as shadows, and I'll just break things up, and only draw the shadow side of things, and that's basically just negative space drawing. It's very simple, and it can be very, very effective. It's a technique that I learned actually from my boss, Mark Silvestri. So here it comes. I'm drawing the shadow from those veins, and now I'm drawing the shadows of the different tendons, and I've got them connected to the veins, and you can see that I'm just breaking it where the light is. And so you're only seeing a series of interconnected shadows, and that's just negative space drawing, and it's an effective way to get some dimension into your drawing. It works actually not just for hands, but for hair. It's very, very effective for hair, for grass, for rocks, for just about everything. I think Frank Miller is probably the the pinnacle of negative space drawing. I mean, his Sin City drawing is all just negative space, and it's really worth looking at just to see how far you can go only just drawing the shadows and nothing else, not drawing any forms at all, just leaving those completely open and just drawing shadows. And it's amazing just how not only how completely clearly you can get something across, but also just how much weight and dimension there is to it. A lot more weight and dimension, I think, to a drawing like that, where there's really nothing drawn but shadows, than there is to something that's completely clearly delineated, but with no shadowing or no line weight at all. So here I'm drawing, basically, it's a similar claw hand to what I drew a few minutes ago, and this one's just pointed downward. So the lighting obviously will be, unless I uplit it, which I'm not going to do, lighting will just be opposite, basically. The shape of the thumb obviously is completely different if the thumb is bent or straightened. here I've got it bent, and you can see actually how different it looks as compared to the thumb just above that's straightened out. The thumb above, similar to the fingers, it has a backwards bend to it. It doesn't just come out straight. And now I'm trying to draw the skin stretch between the thumb and the fingers there, and the tendons from the thumb. And as these drawings start building, piling up, as I do one after the other, I think it starts to become clear that a lot of the same lines that I'm using, I use over and over again. And it's because those are the lines that I've found, for me, work the best to get across the kind of forms that I'm trying to get across. And different artists pick different things. The actual body is so complex, and unfortunately, we don't have lines all over ourselves, ready-made for an artist to pick up and use. You really have to decide what you want to put in and what you want to leave out, and those decisions, go a long way to making up your style. So now I'm going to draw a hand that really shows the uh, the tendons at work. The tendons along the back of the hand. And this is something that, for me, it took a really long time to get comfortable with. I think it was finally actually Frank Frazetta, some of his black and white work, looking at that I finally got a bit of a method that worked for me. And before that, I was drawing a series of random lumps of black and trying to put veins on it, and to a certain extent, I think you could probably argue that I still do that to this day. But what I'm doing here, you can see I'm drawing in, got my hand drawn in, got the fingers. It's basically a relaxed pose. This is my wrist bone. I did it the wrong way, just fixing it there. Got the thumb extensors in, that bone there. And now what I'm doing, this is what really worked for me to learn how to draw the tendons, and that is to actually draw in the tendons, which certainly makes some kind of sense. And I always draw in the muscle between the fingers and the thumb that way, just to give myself a guide for where to put my lighting. Which, again, I'm going to have coming from the upper left. I'm trying to just stay as consistent with that as possible. And I'm really not doing any kind of double lighting, which is a strong light source coming from one side and a weaker light source coming from the other side. It's a whole other thing. I'm trying to use my lighting just to help describe the forms that I'm drawing as simply as possible. So and this is the way that I put my veins in. And veins are great for, well, veins, first of all, naturally exist on the back of your hand, so it looks right. But they just really add a lot of a visual interest to a drawing. So I always just rough them in really quickly, just so I know where they're going to be, because I don't actually want to draw the veins. For me, it's a pretty ineffective way of drawing. What I try and do is do it in a negative space way. So once again, I'll just try and draw the shadow from them, and bearing in mind where I've got my tendons, so I'll go thicker with the vein where it recesses into like a an area between the tendons, and then where it crosses over a tendon, the shadow gets much shallower. So that it you can see already it gives it a lot of dimension doing it that way. And if it weren't for the veins, those shadows that I'm drawing along the tendons would just be an even straight line all the way up, which would really not look the best. I really don't know exactly how the bones of the wrist join with the hand, and I don't think it's entirely important to know down to every tiny little bone. It's important to be able to draw it in a way that it looks convincing and strong. And so you can see that I followed the guide for the veins that I had just sketched in quickly, but without actually just drawing those things in. And you'll notice that I would never draw a vein like a tube, like draw both sides of the vein. I only ever draw the side that's away from the light. And I try and keep that consistent throughout my artwork because drawing both sides of things, I think it doesn't leave room for your brain to complete the drawing. And leaving that little bit of room for your brain to complete the drawing, it makes the viewer interact with your drawing in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. It just makes it